Hello everyone. Today I'll be discussing Bach's English Suite Number 5 in E minor. More specifically, I will be looking at the first movement of this dance suite, the prelude. Now, the first thing to consider when interpreting and playing this prelude, it's to get the establishment of a defined pulse, in which case we want to establish a 2 in a bar field, since the time signature is indicating a compound duple pulse, 6/8 in this case. And I think a common mistake students or even performers might make is they imply a 6 in a bar field, or even implying a simple triple meter pulse, like create, for example. And I think what happens is it makes the music sound a bit too stagnant. And also, talking about the form, because this piece is in a fugal form, a good way to practice the motifs and the various entries is to practice it in isolation, which I mean, you find all of the motifs that occur and then you practice them as it is. I'll demonstrate. There's the first entry. Here's the second one. And then the third. And then the fourth should be here. So in that way, when you look at the score, you just find all of the motifs that occur, and when you practice it in isolation, you can work on how to articulate, and you can work how you want to phrase it. In that way, it will keep the motifs consistent as you play it, and will also sound more consistent as well. And also, what this does, I believe it also trains the student to be able to internally hear and ingrain these motifs, like amidst the polyphonic texture. And this will eventually enable them to create a more balanced and clear sound. Now, articulation is a point that is always worth mentioning when learning and playing Bach's music. Traditionally, you would say shorter note values, i.e. semiquavers, tend to be played more legato, and sometimes a staccato articulation might be used for passages with wide leaps, I guess, like for example in bars 14. You hear the B pedal note there having an octave leap, so you might consider having a more detached articulation. But in the end, it is up to the performer's discretion, and what I'm saying is just a generalization of Baroque articulation, and it shouldn't be treated as gospel, I guess. And also, articulation is very important because it helps create contrast in sound and gives each voice, especially in a fugue, a distinct quality and character. And it's also good to consider how one might orchestrate the different voices and parts in this type of fugal music, because if we can relate musical passages or phrases to certain instruments, like the violin, the cello, the flute, etc., it will aid our musical imagination and provide a clearer picture of how we might articulate something within the music. For example, in bar 22, I guess I can imagine a violin and a cello duet, for example. That's what comes to my mind, but the other performers and interpreters might have a different approach to that. Now, some technical challenges that I face, and perhaps some students might face, is that bar 70 and bar 70 to bar 73, we have these trills, and it can be a bit bothersome because we're forced to use, I guess, our weaker fingers. But a good exercise you could use for that is doing rhythmic exercises. So a 1+2 rhythm, for example. 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1. And then you can do a 1+4. 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, yeah, and etc. And so that's some exercises you can use. Bars 56 and 58 can be a bit bothersome because the synchronization can be a bit off, as in so yeah, I guess the synchronization of the left and right hand can be a bit of an issue, but a good way to solve that is to practice the hands separately and to think rhythmically with the both hands, rather than trying to like align where each note goes with what, which can be a bit annoying sometimes because we're relying on our vision instead of the internal pulse as we play the music. So yeah, thinking rhythmically will allow us to stay in sync with this particular passage. And also another difficulty could be the entries of the motif, because the motif sometimes occurs with double notes and sometimes even like a full chord. So a good way to separate and to make the motif as clear as possible is to hold the notes of the motif and play the other notes, the filler notes, staccato. So this is bar 7. So that's a good way. And another one is bar 12. And etc. And so forth. Examples it's bar 20. Like there. So that's something you can incorporate as a practice technique. And again, and now moving on to dynamics. The dynamics of this prelude can be up to the performer's discretion as well, since Bach doesn't write or indicate any dynamic markings, which is common throughout the majority of his music. For me, I tend to bring the dynamic down slightly when there's episodic material, I guess, and perhaps get louder when there's tension in the harmony. And what I mean by tension in the harmony, if you look at bars 48 to 51, for example, you can consider some dynamic contrast there, or even a build-up, because we're kind of getting like a cadential figure right there. And also, emphasizing the motif, you probably should make it a bit louder, because we need to hear how the motif sounds in the overall polyphonic texture, and especially if performing in a big hall, it is important to bring more emphasis in bringing out that motif. And in bars 34, I just want to point out that there is that B pedal point, and the way you want to play this, you don't want to make it sound too samey or sound too bland. So you don't want it to sound like this. You don't want it to sound too notey, I guess, but I'm exaggerating there. But you kind of want to blend the sound and the harmony together. So you want to do something like that. And also, at this section, it's kind of similar to, I guess, an organ passage. It reminds me of like an organ playing, especially when you have that B pedal note. Like, I just imagine someone, holding down that pedal when they're playing an organ. So that's something you can consider as well. And when we get to bars 40 to, let's say, bars 47, you have some imitative passages. So you have that. And now a good exercise to practice this passage is to practice the imitation separately. So what I mean, I'll demonstrate first and I'll explain what I mean. In that case, yeah. And you can practice the hand separately, and that's a great thing to do, but I think practicing the imitation separately allows the hearer to hear the interplay between these parts and to hear that antiphonic texture, or like the question and answer. And the same can be applied with the left hand. You can use that kind of imitation exercise with the left part as well. And also, just one last thing to consider in terms of a technical approach is to give more length to like the longer note values. And what I mean by that, I'm talking about like bar 16, where you have that D, and then it goes to a C natural, and then a B in the next bar, and then an A. So you have that kind of descending line, and you want to bring a bit more emphasis on that long notes, so like we can really hear it like in the backdrop of all of this polyphony. Be careful not to accent too much though. Yeah, it's just in order to ensure the balance of the sound, which is extremely important in fugal music. And also, last thing before I finish off, in terms of the character of this piece, I consider the prelude to have like a type of dance-like character, which is not a surprise because this is part of a dance suite. However, the impression I get from this piece is that it should be performed as if it was a jig, which is perhaps most evident in the time signature that Bach puts, the 6/8, so that, you know, we want that 2 in a bar feel, which is such a common pulsation in the jig dances. And yeah, and other than that, especially when approaching music like this, practice the hands separately, practice the motif separately, practice imitation passages separately, because it's all about trying to hear all of these different parts while you're playing it. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.